Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she stirred the massive pot of beef stew. The mess hall kitchen at Forward Operating Base Phantom was a cramped, overheated space that barely qualified as functional, but she had learned to work magic within its metal walls. Steam rose from multiple burners while the industrial dishwasher churned in the background, creating a symphony of kitchen chaos that had become her daily soundtrack. At 26 years old, Sarah had been cooking for soldiers for 3 years, but this deployment to Afghanistan was different. The base was smaller, more isolated, and the men who ate her food were not regular infantry. These were Navy SEALs, the most elite warriors the military had to offer, and they had very particular needs. "Martinez, you got any more of that cornbread?" Staff Sergeant Mike Torres called from the serving line. He was built like a truck, with arms that looked like they could bench press a small car, but his voice carried the same respectful tone all the SEALs used when speaking to her. "Coming right up, Sergeant," Sarah replied, pulling a fresh pan from the oven. The golden brown surface steamed as she cut it into squares. She had learned early in her career that soldiers fought better when they ate well, and these men fought harder than anyone. The mess hall began filling up as the evening meal service started. 12 SEALs made up the core team stationed at FOB Phantom, along with a handful of support staff and intelligence personnel. The base was strategically positioned in a valley that allowed them to monitor insurgent activity across 3 provinces, but its remote location also made it vulnerable. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison entered the mess hall, his weathered face showing the strain of command. At 34, he was the team leader, a man whose quiet intensity commanded respect without demanding it. He had been deployed 7 times in his 12-year career, and his experience showed in every decision he made. "Smells incredible in here, Martinez," Morrison said as he approached the serving line. "What's the damage tonight?" "Beef stew with fresh vegetables, cornbread, and I managed to make some apple cobbler with the canned fruit from the last supply drop," Sarah replied, ladling a generous portion into his mess tray. "The vegetables came in on yesterday's helicopter, so they're actually fresh for once." Morrison smiled, one of the rare moments when his command mask slipped. "You spoil us, you know that." Sarah shrugged, but she felt proud of the compliment. Keeping morale high through good food was more than just her job. It was her contribution to the mission. She understood that every meal might be someone's last, and she wanted it to be memorable. As the SEALs settled at their tables, Sarah could hear fragments of their conversations. They spoke in a mixture of military jargon and casual banter that revealed both their professionalism and their humanity. These men dealt with life and death situations daily, but around her dinner table, they were just hungry soldiers grateful for a hot meal. "Martinez, you need to give my wife this stew recipe," said Petty Officer First Class Danny Kim, a sniper whose precision with a rifle was legendary among the team. "She keeps asking what I want to eat when I get home, and this is it." "I'll write it down for you," Sarah promised, though she knew the recipe's success had as much to do with cooking for people you cared about as it did with ingredients and technique. The evening routine continued as Sarah cleaned the kitchen and prepared for the next day's meals. She had learned to work efficiently, knowing that tomorrow might bring supply delays, equipment failures, or worse. The remote location meant she often had to be creative with limited ingredients, but she had developed a reputation for turning basic supplies into memorable meals. Chief Petty Officer Antonio Rodriguez, the team's communications specialist, lingered after the others had left. He was from Texas, like Sarah, and they often talked about home while she finished her kitchen duties. "You know, Martinez, back home I used to think military food was just something you endured," Rodriguez said, helping her stack the last of the clean trays. "But you've changed that. This place actually feels like home sometimes." Sarah felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the kitchen ovens. "That's the idea, Chief. You guys take care of everyone else. Someone needs to take care of you." The base grew quiet as evening turned to night. Sarah finished her prep work for breakfast, checking supplies, and planning the next day's menu. The isolation of FOB Phantom meant that every meal had to be carefully planned, with backup options in case supply flights were delayed or canceled due to weather or enemy activity. As she locked up the mess hall, Sarah reflected on how different her life had become from what she had originally planned. She had joined the army as a cook because it was a way to serve her country while doing something she loved, but she had never expected to find herself caring so deeply about the people she fed. The SEAL team had accepted her as more than just support staff. They included her in their informal family, asking about her life and sharing stories from their own. She knew about Morrison's daughter's soccer games, Torres's mother's battle with cancer, and Kim's plans to open a restaurant after his military service ended. Walking back to her quarters, Sarah noticed Morrison standing outside the command bunker, talking quietly into his radio headset. The conversation looked serious, and she felt a familiar knot of worry in her stomach. The SEALs rarely shared operational details with support staff, but living in such close quarters made it impossible not to notice when something was brewing. The next morning brought the usual breakfast rush, but Sarah detected an undercurrent of tension among the team. Conversations were quieter, more focused, and several of the men seemed distracted. Morrison ate quickly and left without his usual friendly conversation. "Big mission coming up?" Sarah asked Rodriguez as he helped himself to his second cup of coffee. "Can't say much, but yeah, something's on the horizon," he replied carefully. "Might be a few days before we're all sitting around your dinner table again." Sarah nodded, understanding the unspoken message. She began mentally preparing for the possibility of cooking for a smaller group, hoping that wasn't the case, but knowing the reality of their situation. The day passed with unusual efficiency. The SEALs went through their equipment checks and briefings while Sarah prepared what might be their last hot meal for several days. She put extra effort into lunch, making fresh bread and preparing a hearty soup that would stick with them during whatever lay ahead. Late in the afternoon, Morrison approached her in the kitchen. His expression was serious, but not grim, the look of a professional about to undertake a dangerous but necessary task. "Martinez, we're heading out tonight for an extended operation," he said quietly. "Probably be gone 3 to 5 days. Can you handle things here with the skeleton crew?" "Of course, sir. You guys just focus on coming home safe," Sarah replied, meaning every word. Morrison's expression softened slightly. "We always do, and we always look forward to coming back to your cooking." The team ate an early dinner, and Sarah made sure everyone got extra portions. She packed additional rations for them to take, using her personal supplies to ensure they had something better than standard MREs. As they prepared to leave, each team member stopped by the kitchen to thank her and say goodbye. It was an informal tradition that had developed over their months together, a small ritual that acknowledged the family bond they had formed. Torres was the last to leave, pausing in the doorway of the kitchen. "Keep the home fires burning, Martinez. We'll be back before you know it. I'll have something special waiting," she promised. Sarah watched from the mess hall window as the 12 SEALs loaded into 2 helicopters. The aircraft lifted off into the darkness, their running lights quickly disappearing into the vast Afghan night. The base felt immediately emptier, quieter, as if its heartbeat had suddenly slowed. The remaining personnel consisted of Sarah, 2 intelligence analysts, a medic, and 4 soldiers responsible for base security. It was the smallest crew FOB Phantom had operated with since she had arrived, but it wasn't unprecedented. Sarah threw herself into her work, preparing meals for the reduced staff while planning something special for the SEALs' return. She used the quiet time to reorganize her supplies, clean equipment that rarely got deep attention, and experiment with new recipes using their current inventory. 2 days passed without word from the team. This wasn't unusual. Radio silence was common during sensitive operations. Sarah maintained her routine, keeping the mess hall operating normally and the remaining staff fed and comfortable. On the 3rd day, Morrison's voice crackled over the base radio. "Phantom Base, this is Reaper 6. Mission successful. Returning to base. ETA 6 hours." Sarah felt relief flood through her as she began preparing for their homecoming meal. She decided on a celebration feast: roasted chicken with all the fixings, fresh rolls, and a chocolate cake she had been saving ingredients for. But 6 hours passed without the helicopters appearing on the horizon. Then 8 hours. Then 12. The base communications specialist, Sergeant Williams, tried repeatedly to raise the team on their emergency frequency, but received only static in response. Sarah found herself checking the windows constantly, hoping to see the familiar silhouettes of their aircraft approaching. By the next morning, it was clear something had gone wrong. The Rescue Coordination Center had been notified, and search aircraft were being diverted to the team's last known position. Sarah continued cooking, maintaining normalcy for the remaining staff while worry gnawed at her stomach. "They're the best at what they do," Williams assured her as she served breakfast. "If anyone can handle whatever happened, it's them." Sarah nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her family was in serious trouble. She had never felt so helpless, stuck at base while the people she cared about most were missing somewhere in the hostile Afghan wilderness. The day dragged on with no news. Sarah cleaned the kitchen 3 times, reorganized the pantry, and prepared enough food for an army, keeping busy to avoid thinking about the possibilities. Every time the radio crackled to life, she stopped what she was doing to listen, hoping to hear Morrison's voice reporting their safe return. As evening approached, she stood in the empty mess hall, looking at the 12 places she had set out of habit. The silence felt oppressive, broken only by the hum of the refrigeration units and the distant sound of the wind outside. Sarah Martinez had always been the one who took care of others, who provided comfort through food and kindness. Now her soldiers were gone, possibly captured or worse, and she was powerless to help them. But as she stared at those empty chairs, something hard began forming in her chest. These men weren't just her responsibility, they were her family. And if something had happened to them, she wasn't going to sit in this kitchen waiting for news. She had skills beyond cooking, training that every soldier received, but that she had never expected to use. More importantly, she had something that their captors couldn't understand. She knew these men better than anyone, knew their strengths and their habits, knew how they thought, and how they would survive. The SEALs had taught her that family meant never leaving anyone behind. It was time to remind everyone else of that lesson, starting with herself. Sarah began making plans, knowing that tomorrow would bring either news of a rescue or the beginning of her own mission to bring her boys home. Either way, she was done waiting in the kitchen while her family was in danger. The mess hall felt different as she turned off the lights that night. It wasn't just an empty dining room anymore. It was a command post for a mission that hadn't officially started yet. And Sarah Martinez, who had only ever cooked for soldiers, was about to become something else entirely. The 4th day, without contact, brought officials from higher command. Colonel James Patterson arrived via helicopter with a rescue coordination team and immediately established a command center in the base's communications bunker. Sarah watched from the mess hall kitchen as vehicles and personnel flooded onto the small base, transforming it from a quiet outpost into a bustling operational center. She prepared meals for the influx of new personnel while straining to overhear bits of information about the search efforts. The official reports were frustratingly vague. The SEAL team had failed to check in after their mission. Search aircraft had found no trace of their helicopters, and ground teams were being organized to investigate their last known coordinates. "Martinez, report to the command center," Sergeant Williams called from the doorway of the mess hall. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and made her way to the bunker, where Colonel Patterson sat behind a temporary desk surrounded by maps, radio equipment, and intelligence officers. He was a lean man in his 50s with gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. "Specialist Martinez," he began without preamble, "you've been working closely with the missing team. I need you to tell me everything you know about their routines, their habits, anything that might help us understand what happened." Sarah straightened her shoulders. "Sir, they were professional in everything they did." Lieutenant Commander Morrison always emphasized redundancy in communications. "If they're not checking in, it's because they can't, not because they forgot." Patterson nodded, making notes on a legal pad. "What about their mission preparation? Did you notice anything unusual?" "Nothing specific, sir, but they seem more focused than usual. Extra equipment checks, longer briefings. Whatever they were doing was important. Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. They're good men, sir. They wouldn't abandon their mission unless something went seriously wrong. I understand you've developed close relationships with the team members, Patterson continued. That's not uncommon in small unit deployments. But I need you to understand that we have professional rescue teams handling the situation. Your job is to maintain normal base operations. Sarah felt frustration building in her chest. With respect, sir, normal base operations revolved around taking care of those 12 men. They're my responsibility. Patterson's expression hardened slightly. Your responsibility is to follow orders and let the experts handle combat situations. These men knew the risks when they accepted their mission. After being dismissed, Sarah returned to the kitchen feeling more determined than ever. The colonel's attitude confirmed what she had suspected. The official rescue effort would be methodical, careful, and potentially too slow. If the SEALs were prisoners, time was critical. If they were injured and hiding, every day decreased their chances of survival. That evening, as the base settled into its new routine, Sarah made her decision. She began gathering information systematically, using her access to the mess hall and her relationships with the support staff to piece together details about the search effort. From Williams, she learned that the team's last radio transmission had come from a valley approximately 40 kilometers northeast of the base. From the intelligence analyst, she discovered that the area was known for insurgent activity and had several cave complexes that could serve as hiding places or prisons. She also learned something more troubling. The official rescue mission was being scaled back after 2 days of fruitless searching. Resources were limited, and command couldn't justify an extended operation for a missing team when no evidence of their fate had been found. Sarah spent that night studying maps of the region, using her phone to research the terrain and climate conditions. She had grown up hiking and camping in the mountains of Colorado, and while Afghanistan's landscape was different, many of the survival principles were the same. The next morning brought devastating news. A search helicopter had found the wreckage of one of the team's aircraft in a narrow canyon. The crash site showed signs of an explosion, but no bodies had been recovered from the wreckage. Colonel Patterson gathered the remaining base personnel to share the findings. We believe the aircraft was brought down by an RPG or similar weapon, he announced grimly. The second helicopter is still missing, as are all 12 team members. We're expanding the search grid, but I want everyone to understand that this mission has moved from rescue to recovery. Sarah felt her world shift. Recovery meant they were looking for bodies, not survivors. It meant the official military was giving up hope of finding her friend alive. After the briefing, she approached Patterson privately. Sir, request permission to join the ground search teams. Patterson shook his head immediately. Absolutely not. You're a cook, not a combat soldier. You'd be a liability in hostile territory. I know these men better than anyone, Sarah insisted. I know how they think, where they might hide, what they do to survive. I could help. The answer is no, specialist. You'll remain on base and maintain your assigned duties. That afternoon, while preparing lunch for the search teams, Sarah made her final decision. The official rescue effort was winding down, treating her friends as casualties rather than missing personnel who might still be fighting for their lives. If the military wouldn't look for them properly, she would have to do it herself. She began planning in earnest. The base's supply room contained emergency equipment for downed pilots, survival kits, medical supplies, and communication devices. Her kitchen had food that could be preserved and carried for extended periods. Most importantly, she had access to base vehicles and knew the duty schedules of the security personnel. Sarah spent the evening gathering supplies quietly, using her legitimate access to stockpile items she might need. She packed high-energy foods, medical supplies, water purification tablets, and emergency communication equipment. She studied the maps until she had memorized the routes to the team's last known position. The plan was dangerous and probably doomed to failure, but it was better than sitting in the kitchen while her family remained missing. She had spent 3 years taking care of these men, learning their preferences and their personalities, understanding what made them laugh and what worried them at night. That knowledge had to be worth something in finding them. As she made her final preparations, Sarah thought about each team member individually. Morrison would be taking care of his men, even if wounded, probably trying to establish communication with base. Torres would be the muscle, carrying anyone too injured to walk. Kim would be finding defensive positions and planning escape routes. She knew Rodriguez would be trying to fix damaged communication equipment with whatever materials he could find. She knew Williams would be treating injuries with improvised medical supplies. She knew each man's strengths and how they would contribute to group survival. That knowledge gave her hope that they were still alive, but it also told her where to look for them. The SEALs wouldn't stay near the crash site if they could move. They would find defensible positions with good observation of the surrounding area, preferably with access to water and materials for signaling. The maps showed several locations that met those criteria within walking distance of where the helicopter had been found. Sarah marked them as priority search areas, planning a route that would let her check each location systematically. She also planned for the possibility of finding them captured rather than hiding. The intelligence reports mentioned several insurgent groups operating in the area, and she studied their known tactics and hiding places. If her friends were prisoners, she would need to gather intelligence before attempting any rescue. 2 hours before dawn, Sarah put her plan into action. She had memorized the guard rotation and knew there would be a 15-minute window when the vehicle depot was unobserved. She slipped out of her quarters dressed in combat fatigues she had borrowed from the base's lost and found, carrying a pack loaded with supplies. The vehicle she had chosen was a modified Jeep equipped with long-range fuel tanks and communication equipment. It was designed for reconnaissance missions and had the range to reach the search area and return to base without refueling. Starting the engine quietly, Sarah drove toward the base's main gate using a route that would avoid the command bunker and the guard's primary observation points. She had forged paperwork authorizing a supply run to a nearby observation post, which would explain her early departure if anyone noticed. The gate guard was a young soldier named Private Johnson, who knew Sarah from the mess hall. He glanced at her paperwork and waved her through without question, probably assuming she was making an emergency food delivery. As the base disappeared behind her, Sarah felt a mixture of terror and determination. She was leaving behind everything safe and familiar to venture into hostile territory with minimal training and equipment. But she was also finally taking action instead of waiting helplessly while her friends remained missing. The route to the search area took her through increasingly remote terrain. The roads deteriorated from paved surfaces to dirt tracks to barely visible paths through rocky hills. Sarah drove carefully, knowing that a breakdown this far from base would be fatal. After 3 hours of driving, she reached the edge of the area where the helicopter had been found. She parked the Jeep in a concealed position among a cluster of rocks and began the next phase of her mission, searching on foot through terrain that could hide a dozen men or conceal 100 enemies. The morning sun was beginning to heat the rocky landscape as Sarah shouldered her pack and began climbing toward the first potential hiding place on her list. She moved carefully, aware that she was now in the same area where her friends had disappeared, possibly taken by the same enemies who had shot down their aircraft. Every sound made her freeze. Every movement in her peripheral vision sent adrenaline coursing through her system. This was nothing like the safe, controlled environment of the base kitchen where she had spent the last 3 years. This was the real Afghanistan, the dangerous country where warriors like her SEAL friends fought and sometimes died. But as she climbed higher into the hills, Sarah found herself thinking not about the danger, but about the empty chairs in her mess hall. 12 places set for 12 men who weren't coming home without help. Men who had protected her, joked with her, treated her like family. She had spent years feeding their bodies and lifting their spirits. Now it was time to save their lives, even if it meant risking her own. The search area stretched out before her, a maze of valleys and ridges that could hide anything. Somewhere in this landscape, Her friends were either fighting for survival or waiting for rescue that might never come. Sarah Martinez had never been a combat soldier, but she was about to become something just as dangerous. A woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The mission to bring her boys home had officially begun. The first potential hideout turned out to be exactly that, empty caves that showed no signs of recent occupation. Sarah spent 2 hours searching the complex thoroughly, looking for any evidence that the SEALs had taken shelter there. She found old fire pits and scattered debris, but nothing recent enough to indicate her friends had passed through. Moving to the second location required a treacherous climb across a ridge that left her exposed to observation from multiple directions. Sarah moved slowly, using whatever cover she could find while scanning the terrain ahead for signs of movement. The weight of her pack and the altitude made every step an effort, but she pushed forward driven by the thought of 12 empty chairs. The second cave system was more promising. It offered excellent defensive positions and clear views of the surrounding valleys, exactly the type of place Morrison would choose if the team needed to go to ground. Sarah approached carefully, noting disturbed rocks and bent vegetation that suggested recent passage. Inside the main cave, she found her first real evidence, an empty MRE wrapper that was definitely American military issue. The wrapper was recent, maybe 3 or 4 days old based on its condition. Someone had been here recently, and they had been eating military rations. Sarah's heart raced as she searched deeper into the cave system. She found more signs of occupation, sleeping areas scraped into the dirt, a makeshift latrine position for sanitation, and, most telling of all, a crude perimeter alarm system made from rocks and string that would alert anyone inside to approaching visitors. This was definitely where the SEALs had taken shelter, at least temporarily. The question was whether they were still here or had moved on to another location. Morrison, she called softly into the darkness of the deeper caves. Torres? It's Martinez from the base. If you can hear me, I'm here to help. Her voice echoed off the stone walls, but no answer came back. Sarah waited several minutes, listening for any sound of movement or response, but the caves remained silent except for the drip of water somewhere in the darkness. She explored deeper, using her flashlight to illuminate the passages while trying to piece together what had happened. The sleeping areas showed signs of hasty abandonment, with gear scattered and supplies left behind. Whatever had caused the team to leave the shelter, it had been urgent. Near the back of the main chamber, Sarah found something that made her blood run cold. Dark stains on the rocks that looked like dried blood. Someone had been injured here, badly enough to leave significant traces behind. The discovery changed everything. If her friends had been wounded when they abandoned the shelter, they wouldn't have gotten far on foot. They would need another defensible position, probably closer to water, where they could treat injuries and wait for either rescue or recovery. Sarah studied her map again, looking for locations within a few hours' walk that would meet those criteria. There were 2 possibilities: a seasonal stream bed that ran through a narrow canyon about 3 kilometers north, or a series of natural pools fed by underground springs 5 kilometers to the east. The stream bed would offer concealment, but little defense if they were discovered. The springs would provide better security, but would be harder to reach with wounded personnel. Sarah tried to think like Morrison, weighing the options from a tactical perspective. Morrison would choose security over convenience, especially with injured team members who needed time to recover. He would also consider the possibility that their position might be compromised and plan for the need to move again quickly. The springs won her mental debate. Sarah packed up her gear and prepared to leave the cave system, but first she left a message. Using rocks arranged in a pattern that looked natural but would be recognizable to anyone with military training, she spelled out Martinez looking near the cave entrance. If any of her friends returned to this location or if other search teams found it, they would know someone from their own unit was actively searching for them. The hike to the springs took 4 hours through increasingly difficult terrain. Sarah had to climb over rock falls, navigate narrow ledges, and cross open areas where she felt completely exposed. Her legs ached, her back screamed in protest of the heavy pack, and her throat was parched despite rationing her water carefully. But she pressed on, driven by the image of blood on stone and the knowledge that every hour of delay could mean the difference between finding her friends alive or finding them too late. The springs were located in a circular depression surrounded by high walls of rock, accessible only through two narrow passages that could easily be defended by a small force. Underground water had created a series of pools that provided fresh water year-round, making it an ideal location for a prolonged hiding period. Sarah approached the area carefully, aware that if the SEALs were here, they would have established security and might not recognize her immediately. Getting shot by her own friends because they mistook her for an enemy would be an ironic end to her rescue mission. "Morrison, it's Martinez," she called as she neared the first entrance passage. "I'm coming in from the south entrance. Don't shoot the cook." This time, her call was answered. "Martinez? What the hell are you doing out here?" The voice was weak but unmistakably Morrison's. Sarah's relief was so intense, she nearly collapsed. "Looking for you guys. Are you hurt? How many are with you?" "All present and accounted for," Morrison replied. "But we've got wounded and no comms." "How'd you find us?" Sarah made her way through the entrance passage, following Morrison's voice to a concealed position among the rocks overlooking the main pool. What she found there broke her heart and filled her with pride at the same time. The 12 SEALs were arranged in a defensive perimeter around a makeshift medical station where Torres was treating Kim for what looked like a severe leg wound. Several other team members showed signs of injury. Rodriguez had his arm in an improvised sling, and Williams had bandages covering burns on his face and hands. But they were alive, alert, and maintaining military discipline even in their desperate situation. When they saw Sarah emerge from the passage, their faces showed a mixture of relief, confusion, and professional concern. "Sit rep," Morrison ordered, falling back into command mode despite his obvious exhaustion. "Your helicopter was found crashed 4 days ago," Sarah reported. "Search efforts have been scaled back to recovery operations. Command thinks you're all Kia." Morrison's jaw tightened. "Both birds were hit by RPGs simultaneously. We managed to get everyone out before the fuel exploded, but we lost all our communication equipment and most of our supplies. Kim took shrapnel in the leg, Rodriguez dislocated his shoulder in the crash, and Williams got burned pulling people out of the wreckage." Sarah immediately began unpacking her medical supplies. "How long have you been here?" 2 days, Torres answered. "We spent the first day at a cave system to the south, but insurgent patrols started getting too close. Had to move Kim here despite his injury." As Sarah examined the wounded, she realized how serious their situation had become. Kim's leg wound was infected and needed surgical attention. Rodriguez's shoulder was improperly set and causing him constant pain. Williams' burns were healing poorly and showing signs of infection. More critically, they were almost out of water purification tablets and medical supplies. Without resupply, they would face increasingly difficult choices about mobility versus medical care. "Martinez," Morrison said quietly, drawing her aside. "I need to know exactly how you got here and what resources you have available." Sarah explained her unauthorized departure from base, the supplies she had brought, and the vehicle she had hidden several kilometers away. Morrison listened without comment, though she could see him calculating options behind his tired eyes. "You understand you violated about 12 different regulations by coming out here," he said finally. "Yes, sir. You also understand that you've possibly saved all our lives." Sarah felt tears threatening to break through her professional composure. "I couldn't just sit in that kitchen knowing you were out here." Morrison's expression softened slightly. "I know, and I'm grateful. But now we have to figure out how to get everyone home safely." The tactical situation was complex. Kim couldn't walk far on his injured leg, which meant they couldn't simply hike back to Sarah's vehicle. The insurgent patrols Morrison had mentioned were still active in the area, making daylight movement dangerous. But they also couldn't stay at the springs indefinitely. Their limited supplies would run out within days, and Kim's infection was getting worse despite treatment with antibiotics from Sarah's medical kit. "I can get back to the Jeep and bring it closer," Sarah offered. "There's a wadi about 2 kilometers east that I can probably navigate with the vehicle." Morrison shook his head. "Too risky. If you get spotted or break down, we lose our only communication with base and our best chance of extraction." As they discussed options, Sarah found herself thinking about the problem from a different perspective. She had spent years solving logistical challenges in the kitchen, finding ways to feed large groups with limited supplies and unpredictable delivery schedules. This was a similar problem, just with higher stakes. "What if we turn this around?" she suggested. "Instead of trying to get you back to base, what if we bring base to us?" Morrison raised an eyebrow. "Explain." "I can get back to the Jeep and use the radio to contact base directly. Tell them exactly where you are and what condition everyone is in. Request immediate medical evacuation instead of trying to move Kim overland." It was a sound plan, but it had one major flaw. Sarah would have to make the trip back to her vehicle alone, through territory that had already proven hostile to heavily armed SEALs. "Absolutely not," Torres interjected, having overheard the conversation. "You're not trained for combat movement in hostile territory." Sarah looked around at the 12 men who had become her family. Kim was getting weaker by the hour. Rodriguez was in constant pain. Williams needed burn treatment that wasn't available in the field. "Maybe not," she said quietly, "but I'm all we've got." The decision wasn't really a choice. Someone had to make contact with base, and Sarah was the only one mobile enough to reach the radio. She spent an hour going over the route with Morrison, memorizing checkpoints and alternate paths in case she encountered enemy activity. As evening approached, she prepared to make the dangerous journey back to her hidden vehicle. The SEALs had survived 4 days in hostile territory through skill, determination, and teamwork. Now, their survival depended on a cook who had never been in combat, but who refused to abandon the people she cared about. Sarah Martinez had found her missing friends, but the hardest part of the mission was just beginning. The journey back to the hidden Jeep began at sunset, when a fading light would provide cover while still allowing Sarah to navigate the treacherous terrain. Morrison had insisted she wait for darkness despite her arguments about Kim's deteriorating condition, and his tactical expertise proved correct within the first hour. Sarah was halfway across an exposed ridge when she heard the distant sound of engines approaching from the valley below. She immediately dropped flat against the rocks, her heart pounding as she watched a convoy of 3 vehicles moving slowly along the dirt track she had used that morning. Through her binoculars, she could see armed men in the vehicles scanning the hills with obvious purpose. They weren't casual travelers. They were conducting a systematic search of the area. Either they had found tracks from the SEAL team's movement or they had discovered Sarah's abandoned Jeep. The convoy stopped directly below her position, and several men dismounted to examine the ground. Sarah held her breath as they pointed at various locations and gestured toward the hills where she was hiding. They had definitely found something, and they were organizing to search the higher elevations. For 20 minutes, Sarah remained motionless against the rocks while the insurgents below argued and planned. She couldn't understand their language, but their intent was clear. They knew someone was in the area, and they were determined to find them. Finally, the convoy moved on toward the east, following a route that would take them away from both the springs where the SEALs were hidden and the location of Sarah's vehicle. But their presence confirmed Morrison's worst fears. The enemy was actively hunting for the missing team, and time was running out. Sarah waited another hour before resuming her movement, taking a longer route that would avoid the areas where the convoy had been searching. Every sound made her freeze. Every shadow could hide an enemy patrol, but she pressed forward knowing that Kim's life might depend on her reaching that radio. The terrain in darkness was even more challenging than it had been during daylight. Sarah moved slowly, testing each step and using her hands as much as her eyes to navigate the rocky slopes. Several times she nearly lost her footing on loose stones that could have sent her tumbling into a ravine. After 4 hours of careful movement, she reached the area where she had hidden the Jeep. Sarah approached the concealed position cautiously, aware that if the insurgents had found her vehicle, she might be walking into a trap. The Jeep was undisturbed, exactly as she had left it, but Sarah took no chances. She spent 30 minutes observing the area before approaching the vehicle, looking for any signs that it had been discovered or that enemies were watching it. Finally, satisfied that the area was clear, Sarah reached the Jeep and immediately began setting up the radio equipment. The long-range communication system would allow her to contact the base directly, but first she had to establish her exact position using GPS coordinates. Phantom Base, this is Martinez, she whispered into the radio microphone. Do you copy? Static filled her headset for several long seconds before a familiar voice responded. Martinez? This is Phantom Base. Where the hell are you? It was Sergeant Williams from the communications bunker. Sarah had never been so happy to hear another person's voice in her entire life. Williams, I need you to patch me through to Colonel Patterson immediately. I have critical information about the missing SEAL team. Stand by, Williams replied, though Sarah could hear the excitement in his voice. Within minutes, Colonel Patterson's voice came through the radio with unmistakable authority and barely controlled anger. Specialist Martinez, you are in direct violation of orders and are considered AWOL. Explain your current situation immediately. Sir, I have located all 12 members of the missing SEAL team. They are alive, but have wounded personnel who require immediate medical evacuation. The radio was silent for several seconds before Patterson responded. Confirm your last transmission. You have visual contact with the missing team. Affirmative, sir. All 12 team members are alive and coherent. Lieutenant Commander Morrison is in command of a defensive position at grid coordinates. Sarah read off the precise location of the springs where she had left her friends. What is their medical status? Patterson's voice had shifted from anger to professional focus. Sarah provided a detailed report on each injured team member, emphasizing Kim's infected leg wound and the need for immediate surgical intervention. She also reported the insurgent activity she had observed and the likelihood that enemy forces were actively searching the area. Martinez, what is your current position and status? Patterson asked. Sarah provided her coordinates and assured him that she was mobile and undetected. Sir, I can guide rescue aircraft to the team's location, but they're going to need medical evacuation capabilities. Kim can't walk out. Understood. Remain in position and maintain radio contact. We're organizing immediate extraction operations. The relief Sarah felt was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the knowledge that she still had to get back to the springs to help coordinate the rescue. The SEALs were counting on her to guide help to their location, and she wasn't going to let them down. Over the next hour, Sarah coordinated with the base while monitoring enemy radio frequencies that Williams had taught her to recognize. The insurgents were definitely active in the area, and their communications suggested they were closing in on the SEAL team's general location. Martinez, we have 2 helicopters launching in 30 minutes, Patterson reported. 1 medical evacuation bird and 1 gunship for escort. Can you provide on-site guidance for landing zone selection? Yes, sir, but I need to get back to the team's position to coordinate. There are enemy forces in the area conducting active searches. Negative. Remain in your current position. We'll find them using the coordinates you provided. Sarah understood the colonel's reasoning, but she also knew something he didn't. The springs were surrounded by terrain that would make helicopter landings extremely difficult. The pilots would need someone on the ground to guide them to the best approach routes and warn them about obstacles. More importantly, Morrison and his team would need to know exactly when and where to expect the rescue helicopters. Without coordination, the aircraft might arrive during an enemy patrol or find the SEALs in positions that couldn't be reached safely. Sir, with respect, the terrain around their position is extremely challenging for aircraft. I can provide guidance that could save lives and time. Martinez, you've done enough. Let the professionals handle the extraction. Sarah knew she was about to disobey direct orders for the second time in 2 days, but she also knew her friends' lives were at stake. Understood, sir. maintaining radio contact. She didn't say she was staying in position, and Patterson didn't ask for confirmation. Sometimes the most important communications were the ones that weren't spoken directly. Sarah packed up the radio equipment and began the treacherous journey back to the Springs. She moved faster now, knowing that rescue helicopters were launching and that enemy forces were getting closer to her friend's position. The return trip took 3 hours, during which Sarah maintained periodic radio contact with the Rescue Coordination Center. The helicopters were airborne and making good time, but they were still an hour away when she reached the Springs. "Morrison," she called softly as she approached the defensive perimeter. "It's Martinez. I made contact with base." The relief in Morrison's voice was evident even through his professional composure. "Outstanding work. What's the extraction plan?" Sarah briefed him on the incoming helicopters while examining Kim's condition. The SEAL sniper was conscious but obviously weakening, and his leg wound showed signs of serious infection despite their treatment efforts. "Medical bird should be here in 45 minutes, Sarah reported. "But we need to find a landing zone they can actually use." The area around the Springs was surrounded by high rock walls and narrow passages that would make helicopter operations dangerous. Sarah and Morrison spent 20 minutes identifying the best option, a relatively flat area about 500 meters east of the Springs that would require moving Kim over rough terrain, but was the only space large enough for aircraft. As they prepared to move the wounded, Rodriguez picked up movement on one of his observation positions. "Contact," he whispered into his radio. "Multiple vehicles approaching from the southwest. Estimate 12 to 15 personnel." The insurgents had found them with less than 30 minutes before the rescue helicopters arrived. Morrison quickly assessed their options while Sarah helped Torres prepare Kim for emergency movement. "We can't get Kim to the landing zone in time," Morrison decided. "And we can't fight effectively while protecting 3 wounded. Martinez, I need you to get back to your radio and wave off the helicopters until we can deal with this contact." Sarah looked at Kim, who was barely conscious, then at the approaching enemy forces that were now visible moving through the rocks below their position. The mathematical equation was simple. Kim would die without immediate medical attention, but the rescue helicopters would be sitting ducks if they landed during a firefight. "There's another option," she said quietly. Morrison raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening. I can guide the helicopters to an alternate landing zone and help coordinate the extraction while you guys handle the ground threat. Give me Rodriguez and Williams to help move Kim while the rest of you set up a defensive line." It was a desperate plan that divided their limited forces during enemy contact, but Morrison realized it might be their only chance. The rescue helicopters couldn't wait indefinitely, and Kim couldn't survive much longer without surgical treatment. "Do it," Morrison ordered. Sarah Martinez, who had started this mission as a cook looking for missing friends, was about to become a battlefield coordinator directing life and death operations under enemy fire. The hardest part of her journey was still ahead, but she was no longer the same person who had left base that morning. She had become someone who could save lives when it mattered most. The sound of gunfire erupted behind Sarah as she helped Rodriguez and Williams carry Kim toward the alternate landing zone. Morrison and the remaining SEALs had engaged the insurgent force, buying precious time for the evacuation while drawing enemy attention away from the wounded. Kim was barely conscious, his fever spiking despite the antibiotics Sarah had administered. Every step over the rocky terrain caused him obvious pain, but he never made a sound that might give away their position to any insurgents who had flanked the main engagement. "Landing zone in sight," Rodriguez whispered into his radio, speaking to both Sarah and the approaching helicopters. His dislocated shoulder made every movement agony, but he refused to slow their progress. Sarah immediately got on the radio to coordinate with the incoming aircraft. "Rescue flight, this is ground control. Be advised, we have active hostile contact at primary LZ. Diverting to alternate site, grid coordinates follow." "Copy, ground control," came the pilot's voice through the static. "We have visual on muzzle flashes at primary location. Gunship is moving to provide covering fire." The alternate landing zone was a narrow depression between rock formations that would barely accommodate the medical helicopter, but it was their only option. Sarah began marking the approach routes with chemical light sticks, while Williams prepared Kim for rapid loading. 60 seconds out, the pilot reported. The gunfire from the springs was intensifying, and Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of different weapons as Morrison's team engaged multiple insurgent positions. The enemy had clearly brought more force than initially estimated, which meant the defensive action was going to be brutal and probably prolonged. Rodriguez, can you raise Morrison on comms? Sarah asked while preparing the landing zone. Rodriguez tried several times, but got only static in response. Either his radio is damaged or he's too busy to answer, he reported grimly. The rescue helicopter appeared over the ridge, flying low and fast while the gunships circled overhead looking for targets. Sarah guided them toward the landing zone using hand signals and light sticks, her heart pounding as she realized that everything depended on the next few minutes. The medical helicopter settled into the narrow space with rotor blades barely clearing the surrounding rocks. The crew chief immediately jumped out to help load Kim, while the pilot kept the engines running for immediate departure. "Where's the rest of the team?" the crew chief shouted over the engine noise. "Under contact 500 meters west," Sarah replied. "They're holding off insurgents to allow this evacuation." Kim was loaded onto the helicopter along with Rodriguez, whose shoulder injury required surgical repair. Williams insisted on staying to help coordinate the extraction of the remaining team members, despite his burns. "Tell Morrison we'll be back for the rest in 15 minutes, the pilot said as they prepared to depart. "Gunship is going to work over the insurgent positions and buy us some maneuvering room." As the medical helicopter lifted off, Sarah felt both relief and terror. Kim was on his way to life-saving medical treatment, but Morrison and 9 other SEALs were still trapped in a firefight with unknown numbers of enemy forces. The gunship pilot came on the radio with a tactical assessment. "Ground control, I count approximately 20 insurgents in 3 separate positions around your team's location. They've got your guys surrounded, but can't advance due to superior defensive positioning." Sarah realized that Morrison had chosen his battlefield perfectly. The springs provided excellent defensive cover while limiting the insurgents' ability to mass their forces for an assault. But the SEALs were also trapped, unable to withdraw without exposing themselves to concentrated fire. "Can you provide close air support?" Sarah asked the gunship pilot. "Negative. Target positions are too close to friendly forces. One wrong shot could hit your people." Sarah studied the terrain around the springs while listening to the ongoing firefight. The insurgents were maintaining their positions, but not advancing, which suggested they were waiting for reinforcements or trying to wear down the SEALs' ammunition supply. "Williams," she said to the medic who was preparing defensive positions around their current location, "what kind of explosives training did you get in basic?" Williams looked at her with surprise. "Standard demolitions." "What?" Sarah pointed to a rock formation that overlooked the main insurgent position. If someone could get up there with explosives, they could break up that enemy concentration and give Morrison's team a chance to withdraw. That someone would have to cross 500 meters of open ground under fire, Williams pointed out. "And we don't have any explosives." Sarah's mind raced through the limited options available. The rescue helicopter would return in 10 minutes, but that might be too late if the insurgents receive reinforcements or if the SEALs ran low on ammunition. "What about the Jeep?" she asked suddenly. "It's got a full fuel tank and probably some emergency flares or smoke grenades." Williams caught on to her, thinking immediately. "You want to turn it into a car bomb." "Not exactly a bomb. More like a very large distraction that might break up their positions long enough for Morrison to move his people." It was an incredibly dangerous plan that required Sarah to return to her hidden vehicle, drive it across hostile terrain, and somehow position it to maximum effect without getting shot by either side. But it might be the only way to tip the tactical balance in favor of her friends. "I'll go with you," Williams offered. Sarah shook her head. "You need to coordinate the helicopter extraction from here, and someone has to make sure we don't accidentally get shot by our own people." Before Williams could argue further, Sarah was moving toward the area where she had hidden the Jeep. The route took her away from the main engagement, but she could still hear the intensity of the firefight and knew that time was running out. The Jeep started immediately, and Sarah began planning her approach to the battlefield. She needed to create maximum chaos and confusion among the insurgent positions while giving Morrison's team clear signals about her intentions. Williams, get on the radio and tell Morrison to watch for my approach from the north. When I hit the insurgent positions, he needs to be ready to move immediately. Roger that. And Martinez, be careful. Sarah drove the Jeep toward the sounds of combat, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. She had never been in a firefight, never been shot at, never done anything remotely resembling combat operations. But she had spent 3 years taking care of the people who were now trapped in that deadly engagement. They were her family, her responsibility, and she would not abandon them. The insurgent positions became visible as Sarah crested a low ridge. She could see muzzle flashes from multiple locations and the occasional glimpse of enemy fighters moving between cover positions. Morrison's team was invisible from her angle, protected by the rocky terrain around the springs, but she could hear their return fire. Sarah floored the accelerator and aimed the Jeep directly at the largest concentration of insurgent fighters. Her plan was simple: drive into their midst at high speed, detonate the fuel tank using emergency flares, and create enough chaos for Morrison to extract his team. The insurgents saw her coming when she was still 200 meters away, but they didn't immediately understand the threat. Several fighters turned their weapons toward the approaching vehicle, but most continued focusing on the SEAL positions. That tactical mistake gave Sarah the advantage she needed. She held the Jeep on course until the last possible moment, then dove from the driver's seat while the vehicle continued toward the enemy positions. Sarah hit the ground hard, rolling down a rocky slope while bullets whistled overhead. The Jeep plowed into the insurgent position exactly as planned, scattering fighters and crushing their makeshift defensive positions. The fuel explosion that followed created a fireball that lit up the entire area, providing Morrison's team with perfect visibility of the remaining enemy positions. The SEALs immediately took advantage of the confusion, advancing aggressively while the insurgents were still recovering from the shock of the explosion. All stations, this is rescue flight, came the pilot's voice over Sarah's radio. We're inbound for immediate extraction. Clear the landing zone. Sarah crawled back up the slope toward Williams' position, her ears ringing from the explosion and her body aching from the fall. Behind her, she could hear Morrison's voice coordinating the final assault that would clear the remaining insurgents from their positions. The rescue helicopter appeared overhead just as the last shots of the engagement were fired. Morrison and his remaining team members emerged from their defensive positions and moved quickly toward the landing zone, carrying their gear and watching for any remaining threats. Outstanding work, Martinez, Morrison said as they reached the helicopter. His face was covered in dust and smoke, but his eyes showed the pride and respect of a professional warrior for someone who had earned it. As the helicopter lifted off with all personnel safely aboard, Sarah looked down at the battlefield where her desperate plan had played out. The burning wreckage of the Jeep was still visible among the scattered insurgent positions, a testament to what someone could accomplish when the people they cared about were in danger. How did you know that would work? Torres asked over the engine noise. Sarah thought about the question for a moment before answering. I didn't, but I knew what would happen if I didn't try. Back at FOB Phantom, Colonel Patterson was waiting as the helicopters landed. His expression was unreadable as the team disembarked and the wounded were rushed to the medical facility. Specialist Martinez, he said formally, report to my office immediately. Sarah followed the colonel to the command bunker, expecting to face serious disciplinary action for her unauthorized mission. Instead, Patterson closed the door and looked at her with something that might have been respect. That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the most foolish, he said quietly. Possibly both. Sir, I just couldn't let my friends down. Patterson nodded slowly. 12 highly trained Navy SEALs are alive today because a cook refused to accept that they were lost. That's not something that happens in a normal course of military operations. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the same mess hall where this story had begun, preparing dinner for a full complement of SEALs who were once again stationed at FOB Phantom. Kim was walking without a limp, Rodriguez had full use of his shoulder, and Williams' burns had healed completely. But something had changed in the relationship between Sarah and her SEAL family. They no longer saw her as just the cook who took care of them. They saw her as one of them, someone who had proven that courage and determination mattered more than training or equipment when lives were on the line. Martinez, Morrison said as he approached the serving line. "What's the damage tonight?" "Same as always, sir," Sarah replied with a smile. "Taking care of my boys." But they all knew it was different now. Sarah Martinez had cooked for soldiers for 3 years, but when it mattered most, she had become something else entirely, a warrior who would never leave family behind. The mess hall filled with the usual evening conversations and laughter, 12 places set for 12 men who had come home because someone cared enough to risk everything for them. And in the kitchen, Sarah continued doing what she had always done best, making sure her family was fed, safe, and never forgotten. The empty chairs would never haunt her again.